Well, welcome to another Archaeological Institute of America Los Angeles County chapter book talk, which we inaugurated here during the pandemic and have become sort of a staple of our program. My name is Aaron Burke. I'm the president of the LA County Society chapter, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity tonight to have John W.I. Lee from UC Santa Barbara talk to us about his recent book. I've known John for a number of years now. He's in the Department of History at UC Santa Barbara, associate professor, working in classical studies by and large. And many of the things that, I particularly enjoyed over the years and tracking, and I think we have a lot more to talk about here in the years going forward, is his work on Greek mercenaries, which is really fun stuff with regard to the complexities of sort of the historical picture and trying to integrate it in the archaeological picture and to sort of reconstruct what we understand of Greek mercenary life. And his first book with Cambridge University Press in 2007 is called A Greek Army on the March, Soldiers and Survival in Xenophon's Anabasis. And a number of his publications have fleshed out various aspects of Xenophon, that period, the Greek and Persian interactions, of course, a large part of which involves these Greek mercenaries and the experience associated in fighting on both sides of that conflict, which is interesting. But there's also a component to his work in recent years, which involves more of a historical analysis of the individuals who have made up the field and have contributed to our understanding of the classical world. And tonight, he will be presenting from the research of his most recent book that came out with Oxford University Press, that's entitled The First Black Archaeologist, A Life of John Wesley Gilbert, who lived from 1863 to 1923. And he's been making the rounds with this book, so it's making a splash, and we're delighted to have him here. He'll present, and then I'll moderate some questions from our audience and that might come up or give you a chance to talk about the things that you haven't put into the talk. So John, without further ado, I look forward to hearing from you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Aaron, for that introduction and for the generous invitation to speak for the AIA Los Angeles. I see a number of friendly faces in the audience, which is great, and others from your group. So let me start by sharing the screen. Okay, and there we are. Okay. So I'm delighted to have a chance to talk a bit more about my biography of John Wesley Gilbert. And I thought that instead of giving you a summary of the whole book, I would focus on one aspect this evening, which might be of particular interest to archaeologists, and that is Gilbert's place in the early development of American archaeological exploration in Greece. Although my book is The First Black Archaeologist, John Wesley Gilbert was actually not the first African-American scholar who planned to go to Greece. Two others tried to go in the 1880s, one of whom, Wiley Lane, died of pneumonia in 1885. And the second, William Sanders Scarborough, was perhaps the most famous African-American scholar of his day, couldn't go because he couldn't get funding. And I wanted to mention that because one of the members of your AIA chapter, Dawn Cox, who is a school teacher, and I think some of you know her, actually has received one of the first William Sanders Scarborough Awards to go to Greece with the American School of Classical Studies. And for those of you who weren't familiar with her Archaeology 101 class, I wanted to share these pretty neat photographs of how she set up an archaeology project on her school campus with her students, and took them through the basics of excavating, describing, recording, and so on. And it's a really a vivid example of how you can bring archaeology into the classroom, even for younger students. And Dawn will be going to the American School, sort of following the footsteps of John Wesley Gilbert. She's going this summer to the summer session. So in my book, I tell the extraordinary story of a man who was born into slavery in 1863, and he rose to become a nationally known figure in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but his name was really not well known amongst scholars of the classics and of archaeology, although he remained well known in the Methodist tradition because of his mission work. And he had a life of firsts. He was the first student, the first graduate, the first Black professor of a small college, Paine College in Augusta, Georgia, which was a cooperative interracial foundation of Black and white Methodists. He was the first African-American member of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And in fact, he was one of the first 50 Americans of any background to go to Greece to do professional archaeological work in Greece. And in part because of his year at the American School, he wrote a thesis that helped him become the first African-American to earn an advanced degree from Brown, and one of the first handful really of African-Americans anywhere in the United States to have an advanced degree in classical studies. And my book traces that story of his rise from being born into slavery through his education, his archaeology, his time in Greece, but also his subsequent life. And I'm not going to talk about that, but if you have questions, we can talk more about his mission work in the Belgian Congo and his work as a civil rights leader and educator at Paine College, where he taught almost until his death in 1923. Instead, the bit I want to focus on today is his time in Athens and especially his excavation work as part of the story of American archaeology in Greece. And many of you know Greece today, but Greece in 1890, when John Wesley Gilbert got there, was a very different place, both territorially and in terms of its level of development. You can see the narrow gauge railway in the photograph to the right, which had just barely been completed when Gilbert landed at Patras and took it along the north coast to Athens in the fall of 1890. He passed over the incomplete Corinth Canal. It would still be 2 more years before the Corinth Canal was completed. And when he arrived in Athens, he reached a city not of 3+ million people, which many of you know today, but a city of about 100,000 people, much of which was still open territory south of the Acropolis. This map from 1890 really gives you a sense of how much of the region of modern Athens remained unsettled. And he went to an American school that was so new that it's not even on this 1890 map. I have to draw it in for you, and you can see the American school there on the far eastern outskirts of the city. Sorry, let me mute those notifications so they don't keep ringing while I'm talking. So you can see the American school there. The Americans were latecomers compared to the French and the Germans, and they were sort of friendly rivals with the British school, who had recently completed their own building right next door to the American school building in the eastern outskirts of town. And it's just, I think, very evocative to look at these pictures and to imagine how much the city has changed in the century plus since Gilbert was there. This is the building under construction. He would have seen very much the same view. Here is that same place, more or less, the last time I was in Athens at the American School, with the view entirely taken up by skyscrapers, apartment blocks, sorry, and the hospital. The same thing for much of the archaeology that we are familiar with today in the early 21st century. The process of uncovering the ancient city was really picking up steam at the time Gilbert arrived in Athens, but some major sites, some of you will recognize this, the so-called Stoa of the Giants, were still completely uncovered. In fact, in Gilbert's day, there was a debate about whether this was the location of what we now know, watch the bicyclist, as the Athenian center of the Athenian Agora and the Stoa of the Giants here. And that bicyclist is standing right about here. So it was a very different Athens he went to in a very different time for the development of archaeology. And during his year, Gilbert did a lot of walking all throughout Athens with the other 3 students of the American School group, and their professor, Rufus Richardson of Dartmouth. You can see Rufus Richardson here. along with his wife, who's sitting here. This is the library they sat in. Some of you have sat in this very library. I know that I sat there, actually sat at this seat right here, and you can see that things like the doors, the bookshelves, and even the fireplace have not changed since the end of the 19th century. And in addition to walking around Athens extensively, walking through Attica, visiting Marathon and Rhamnous and other sites, Gilbert used this library to write his thesis on the demes of Athens, or the urban demes of the city, which he presented early in February 1891. And that made him really the first American scholar to write about this topic. And in some ways, he stands at the beginning of a long train of American scholarship on the demes and their organization and their topography. Unfortunately, that thesis does not survive for us. It has been lost somewhere along the way. And in my book, one thing I do is as ancient scholars do, I reconstruct what he might have written about based on the secondhand reports and the surviving fragments of what we know of his research, but we don't actually have the actual thesis itself. So his school year included activities that we still associate with American scholarship in Greece today. Walking the landscape, looking for ancient topography, reading a lot of Pausanias, reading a lot of Herodotus, doing library work in the American school library, and also participating in archaeology. And now again, many of you either have taken part in, have led, or are familiar with the archaeological projects of the American school today. And from the vantage point of the 21st century, where the school is such a well-developed, highly organized, decently financed institution, a major international center, it's easy to forget that in the beginning, American archaeology in Greece was a very, very tenuous affair. And Gilbert's experience in Greece actually kind of fits well into those early years, when the school was the American school was a very ad hoc operation with an annual director who was elected each year, so not a lot of continuity. Until 1889, it didn't have a permanent building, so the students and professors lived in rented rooms, and without a lot of expertise, because in the 1880s, there were few American scholars who could really be called archaeologists. There were epigraphical specialists, but in American universities, you could not easily point to someone you would call an archaeologist at the time that Gilbert went to Athens. So forget this picture of the American school and think about these tentative and halting first steps. Now, Letitia will know that the first American excavation was actually not an American school excavation. It was an AIA excavation at Assos in 1881. But the school's excavation history in Greece really begins with excavations at Thorikos in 1886, led by student Walter Miller, who later taught at the University of Missouri and at Stanford, and whose translation of Cyropaedia is still referenced by folks today. That's another part of the early story of the American school. If you look at the Loeb Classical Library volumes, many of the early translations, the early volumes, are the work of scholars who were also at the American school. So Walter Miller's excavations at Thorikos were as thorough as he could make them for the time, but still pretty basic. Here is his plan. He also used photographs. In particular, you'll notice that he has no elevations, and that's a feature of the early American excavations, where they measure distances, they mark features as carefully as they can, but they don't have any equipment for taking elevations at an archaeological site. So they're not yet digging stratigraphically in the sense that those of you who dig are familiar with. They're really sort of stumbling toward this, sometimes emulating the Germans who are more advanced, sometimes emulating the British, less often taking guidance from the French. And the early school excavations are very much focused on excavating the theaters. I mentioned Thorikos. Here's the theater at Sicyon, where the school excavates in a couple of different seasons. One reason for that being that excavating a theater enabled classical scholars to test out their theories about the positioning of actors and chorus, and therefore to get a better understanding of classical Greek drama. It was an approach that's kind of conditioned by the interests of the scholars of the day. They were looking at the theater not as a thing in itself to begin with, but as a way to understand Greek literature. The American methods got better over the course of the 1880s. And if you had to say one person who was perhaps the most advanced, Augustus Merriam of Columbia, who was the annual director in 1887 and 1888, started the excavations at the rural Dean site of Ikaria, which we know today as Ikarion. Once again, it had a theater connection because this is supposed to be the hometown of Thespis. But Merriam was a bit more advanced in his methodology. In addition to recording artifacts, he, for the first time, records elevations of the different levels of his site. And he also put a lot more emphasis on rural survey. So the Americans were walking around northeastern Attica looking for the remains of ancient sites, looking for inscriptions, which they found, including a very important one, which details the finances of the rural theater here at Ikaria. And they were able to actually locate a new deme, Plothea, which is, I think, northwest of Ikaria itself. But once again, Merriam was just annual director. He went back to Columbia. He remained very interested in demes. One of his students wrote a dissertation on the deme Archaea, which of course is the deme of my favorite Greek author, Xenophon, in the 1890s. But that kind of the annual directorship situation meant that this knowledge and expertise was not being passed on from year to year with this school that was, very much in its infancy. Backward, we want to go forward. And when the American school finally got what they called a permanent director, Charles Waldstein, it got a scholar who was really much more of a transitional figure between the older artistic appreciation, aesthetic appreciation of Greek art, and the newer emphasis on a scientific archaeology. It's easy these days to criticize Waldstein, but his approach was very much looking for pretty things. And he had made his reputation by identifying sculpture fragments, one in the Louvre, and matching it to a missing spot on in the Parthenon sculptures, and another piece from the British Museum. He did the same thing. So he had a reputation, but as an archaeologist, his emphasis was always on digging for pretty stuff, for sculpture, for painted pottery, and he tended to be hasty and not to keep good records. And those characteristics show up in the excavations he led at Plataea in the late 1880s and into the early 1890s. Now, the other side of archaeology, as once again an archaeological group will know, is survey. And in this period in the 1880s, the American scholars are also kind of stumblingly, haltingly taking their first steps toward survey. The first official survey the American school undertakes is by a student, John Crow, with the help of a visiting architect, Joseph Clark, and they survey the Pnyx, trying to test out Ernst Curtius's theory that this wasn't actually the assembly place, but it was the site of a sanctuary. And this gives you an idea of the level of sophistication of their survey. And by the way, they did not have any survey instruments, so the Americans had to borrow instruments, a transit from the generous Heinrich Schliemann, who of course had instruments to spare. So that was the first survey was with borrowed instruments. It also explains why no elevations, because the school doesn't have the equipment yet in its first excavations. Subsequent surveys in the 1880s are of this sort. Here's the Anthedon survey, which describes the finding of some pottery, roughly locates some items, but what you get is really a sketch map and nothing more systematic than that. And it is in 1890, though, that the level of survey expertise takes a real step upward. When a geologist named Henry Stevens Washington and a young American school student, Herbert Hale, do a survey of Plataea. I'm guessing no one has heard of Henry Stevens Washington. I had never heard of him either, but he's a major figure in the development of American geology. And so his survey is quite interesting for the attention it pays to the composition of soil and the different types of clay, and to his more precise measurements. And it appears that Washington was the person who first brought surveying instruments to the school, and he may even have left them there, because Augustus Merriam thanks Washington for taking elevations at Icaria. So here's a step forward towards archaeology as we know it. And some of the features of this survey map, for example, the lettered towers will also show up in the survey that we're going to focus mostly on for the last part of my talk today, which is John Wesley Gilbert's work with John Picard at the site of ancient Eretria. So let's go on to that. Now, if you are a historian of early Greece, you know Eretria for its well, I won't say dark age, for its early Iron Age prosperity. You may know it for its Neolithic settlement. You may know it for its habitation as far back as the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age. But when the Americans looked at Eretria in 1890, their knowledge was mostly focused on the historic period, and especially the Eretrian support for the Ionian rebellion in the 490s, followed by the Persian sack of the city on the way by the Persian assault force on its way down the coast to the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. And there was some attention to the later settlement of the site, in particular whether Eretria had been resettled after the Persian invasion on the same spot as it had been located before the Persian sack. But oops, sorry, I don't know why Zoom does that. In the 19th century, Eretria first began to come to attention in the years of the 1870s, when antiquities dealers began to sell beautiful painted funeral vases, lekithoi, on the antiquities market. And this was a period where you could buy antiquities openly. In fact, into the 1900s, the Baedeker guidebook has a section on where do you buy your antiquities. So it was perfectly legal to buy antiquities. And this attracted the attention of the government. And the looting was so extensive that in 1885, the government actually stationed guards, which the Greek government did not have a lot of resources. So it was a big move. And they sent a young man named Christos Tsuntas, who again, you Bronze Agers may know, later the kind of the key figure in Bronze Age Mycenaean studies. And he did the first official excavations. And after that, the Greeks relied on a system where local people, if they dug and they found stuff on their land, they could turn half into the government for the museum, and they got to keep the other half, which of course spurred even more digging. And in 1889, especially, there was a big crop of painted lekithoi that were found. And that is one reason why the Americans went there in early 1889. In particular, Charles Waldstein, who had arrived to join the American school, and John Wesley Gilbert and the other students had seen these new vases in the National Museum, and 3 of them depicting Homeric scenes were being published by the British School's first woman student, Eugenie Sellers, later Eugenie Sellers Strong. So I think it was the siren song of these lekithoi, you could say, that was really drawing Waldstein to Eretria. And he would start off the excavation. If you want to ask me about the scandal, I can tell you later, but the excavation would start in the end of January when there was snow and rain, and it would go through February and March, which are very, very cold and muddy and unsuitable conditions for digging in Greece, very much the opposite of what we experience if you're digging in Greece, typically in the summer today. So in the end of February 1891, John Wesley Gilbert, accompanied by his fellow student John Picard, were the last 2 members of the American school to arrive at Eretria. So the others that were already there, I mentioned Charles Waldstein, Professor Richardson from Dartmouth. The other students were Carlton Brownson, once again, translator of the Loeb Anabasis, and Andrew Fossum, who probably you've never heard of, but he was one of the first Norwegian Americans to get a PhD in classical, or actually the first Norwegian Americans to get a PhD in anything, not just classical studies. And Fossum had studied at Johns Hopkins with Basil Gildersleeve. So John Wesley Gilbert arrives after a fall and winter spent in topographical study in Athens, in library study where he wrote his thesis, and now he's going to turn his attention to archaeological study in company with John Picard. And the two men have already worked together in their topographical studies of Athens. I mentioned Gilbert's thesis on the demes of Athens, which was most likely focused on topography. Picard had written a topographical thesis as well about the topography of the area south of the Athenian Acropolis. So the two men had already worked together on a survey sort of project, and they were now set to work at doing a survey of the ancient city. And Eretria has a very interesting modern history. After it was abandoned in late antiquity, it remained kind of a marshy ruin until the 1830s, when the newly independent Greek kingdom decided to make it sort of a showcase city, a grid planned masterwork. You can see the architect Edward Schaubert's plan for Eretria with these broad avenues and plataeas and public buildings. And it was going to be the site of Greece's Naval Academy right here. So there were grand plans for Eretria, and it was called Nea Psara because the first settlers were refugees from the island of Psara, who had struck a major blow in the early stages of the Greek independence war. So just as Eretria had risen from the ashes in antiquity, so now it was going to rise from the ashes of the Ottoman occupation and be a symbol for independent Greece. But the mosquitoes had other ideas. The landscape is very marshy, and malaria became a big problem. And the malaria and the mosquitoes drove most of the population away up the coast to Chalkis, which of course today is a thriving town. So that by the time Gilbert and Picard landed here on the shore of Eretria, it was a little village of just a couple of hundred people, with weeds growing in the streets and rundown houses, and not much sign of life, because even many of the village's inhabitants were off for the winter in Chalkis. What they were able to see, though, was the original version of this plan, because Rufus Richardson mentions the plan, and their survey map, which I'll show you later on tonight, shows some similarities with that plan, in particular in the grid of the streets and the line of these of the walls and towers. So they most likely saw the original plan, which no longer exists today. If you look closely down here, you'll see that what I'm showing you is not the original plan, but sorry, I don't know why Zoom does that, but this is a copy from 1928. So the original has been lost, but Gilbert and his teammate Picard saw the original plan, and it influenced their survey. Now, they weren't the first ones to attempt an archaeological plan of Eretria, but their plan and their survey was by far the most thorough. And if you think back to the history of survey and archaeology that I mentioned, the survey that Gilbert and Picard did really was a major step forward in American archaeology in Greece. And I want to go into some of the details in the last part of my talk. Let's see there. Oh, so before I forget, here is a picture of what Eretria looked like when Gilbert and Picard arrived. You can see in the foreground some blocks of the ancient harbor fortifications, and they would spend time both along the shore here and actually traveling out in boats, probably in the harbor, looking for remains. You can see the remains of a tower over here, which is now lost. And another detail or point to note is the snow. I mentioned they're here in February and March. This appears to have been Greece's coldest winter in decades. Some of the Greek people with whom the Americans talked in Athens said there was snow in Athens on the streets, and they couldn't remember that since about 1871. So it was a very, very cold winter. And the Americans were staying in a house which had been abandoned in the village, and the cook of the American school had actually fixed it up. And they were lucky. Gilbert and his fellow Americans were lucky because the cook Nicolaki was also a skilled carpenter. So he fixed up this house. He fixed the chimney. He fixed the shutters so they had heat. And he found another abandoned house that he could set up a kitchen in. And that's another aspect of American archaeology, is its dependence or its reliance on Greek workers to help keep the excavation going. So it's cold, it's uncomfortable. It's a very different experience from what you might associate with archaeology in Greece today. Now, for Waldstein, as I mentioned, archaeology was above all about finding pretty things. And the record of Waldstein's explorations at Eretria, which you can trace day by day because he kept a diary. The diary is at the International Olympic Archives in Lausanne. And he traces day by day his kind of progress across the landscape in search of tombs. The basic method being to have the Greek workmen lead the way to a promising site that might have architecture above the surface, and then just to start digging in hopes that they would find something. And the something was often gold jewelry, those painted lekithoi that I mentioned, and less rarely anything of architectural interest. Waldstein was not very interested in inscriptions. That was left to Rufus Richardson, who would walk sometimes 3 or 4 miles out into the countryside to look at an inscription that someone had reported finding. But Waldstein's method was this kind of digging, looking for treasure. And here's an entry from his journal that really encapsulate this. We all stood about and helped, which is an odd way to put it because it's the Greek workers are doing the digging, had to take away layers of large porous stone. Sorry about that. I don't know why that keeps going backward. There we go. That's actually probably this stone you can see right here. This photograph was probably taken on the 27th, and there's the pickaxe they used to break up the stone. Most exciting saw gold up here. And it would actually be in this tomb later that Waldstein would find an inscription which referenced a daughter of a person named Aristotle, which would lead him to conclude that this was the tomb of the Aristotle, the philosopher Aristotle. An identification which has had a very long life. Even as late as 2016, a Greek scholar was claiming that Waldstein was wrong and that he had found Aristotle's tomb in the north of Greece. And it sounds crazy. Like, why would Waldstein think this was Aristotle's tomb? It is important to remember that when the Americans were at Eretria, this had just been published. The Aristotelian Athenaion Politeia had just been published, announced by the British Museum in January 1891. So people had Aristotle in the brain. So if you could find a papyrus with Aristotle's words from antiquity, I mean, could it be that much more of a challenge to find Aristotle's actual grave? And if people know anything about the Americans at Eretria, they know that Waldstein claimed to find the tomb of Aristotle, and they sniff at it. So that Eretria has gone down as a place where the Americans looked silly. But the real scientific contribution was not this flitting back and forth, but it was the more careful digging that Andrew Fossum, by the way, you can see Fossum here. He was pulled off the theater for this day, but he took careful notes, which don't survive. But Fossum actually did a very careful study of the theater, and it was the survey that Gilbert and Picard did together of the site of Eretria. And Gilbert actually describes his survey work in an article that he sent back to the New York Independent, which was a weekly newspaper published in New York City that Rufus Richardson had a family connection to. I think it was his father-in-law was the publisher. And he says, less exciting yet no less important is survey, tracing and measuring the walls, noting their towers, construction, the stones, and mapping everything of archaeological significance. So you see here Gilbert and Picard with what's probably a Greek workman at the center, and the remains of the southeast gate of the city of Eretria. Here, the Acropolis rising behind. The marshes are out here. Actually, Waldstein is probably out there somewhere looking for treasure. And so the survey of Picard and Gilbert was very important and valuable because it recorded traces of the city that have since been lost or dragged away. In fact, if you ask Sylvain Fachard, who is the director of the Swiss school now and has worked extensively on Eritrea's fortifications, he will mention the value of the survey work that they did. Less exciting, yet no less important indeed. And this photograph shows Gilbert on the left and Picard here on the right in the process of their survey around the harbor of Eritrea. Now, I should mention that Picard was notoriously bad at speaking Greek. His Greek was terrible. It was he was the butt of jokes about this. And it was partly because his wife, his mother-in-law, and 2 other family members all came with him to Athens, and Picard and his family lived together in a separate house away from the American school, so he didn't get much practice speaking Greek. But John Wesley Gilbert's Greek became very good over the course of the year, and so when you see these photographs of Gilbert and Picard with Greek workers and sailors and others, it was Gilbert who did the translating and the interaction with the local people. And this photograph in particular is it's a striking discovery that made it into my book just days before it had to go to Oxford. And I had asked Natalia Volkaikov-Brogan, the archivist of the American School, I asked, well, Natalia, do you have any landscape shots of Athens around 1890? Maybe something taken from the Cavitas so I can use it to show the urban development of the city? And she said, okay, I'll look. And she came back a couple of days later and she said, I did not find any such pictures, but I did find this photograph of Gilbert and Picard, which was misfiled. And so this photograph made it into the book. It was taken in March of 1891, and it was somehow lost in the school's archives until Natalia rediscovered it in May 2021. And the process of its being lost might have something to do with the recataloging of the school's photographs sometime maybe in the early 1900s, because you can see here this number has been crossed out and another number is inserted in the upper right. And for some reason, this just got put in the wrong place. But where the 2 men are standing, Gilbert here and Picard here, is right here at what they labeled a small harbor, a set of blocks along the shore. You can see how fresh and clean they are. And those blocks in that small harbor have basically disappeared today under beachside construction. There's a series of patios and terraces that have been built right out over the water. So their description of this area is invaluable because you can no longer see the shoreline or these ancient remains. Now I'm coming to the end. Yeah, here's the original survey map, which has a nice, again, preserved at the American School, has a nice little humorous touch. If you zoom in a little bit, you see that Picard and Gilbert have written dormitory. There's their building that Nicolaki the cook fixed up, and there's the salle à manger, where the other abandoned building where he set up the kitchen. And this still survives in the school's archives. And in the publication, it was Picard alone who ended up publishing the results of the survey, most likely because Gilbert had to leave early. Gilbert's wife was pregnant; she was due to give birth, and most likely he headed home early in order to be there for the birth of his second child. And Picard could have written his teammate out of the story entirely. But I think it's notable that in his 1891 report, a topographical study of Eritrea, he thanks John Wesley Gilbert not once, but twice. Mr. John W. Gilbert is responsible for all the chain measurements, and the acknowledgements are also due to Mr. Gilbert, putting Gilbert in front of Waldstein, Richardson, Brownson, and even Dr. Dirkfeldt. So the great Wilhelm Dirkfeldt is last on the list. And I think this reflects the close working relationship that the two men had. In 1891, the standard instrument for measuring was not a tape, although there were linen tape measures and the newfangled steel tape measures were coming in. It was this device called a Gunter's chain or a survey chain, which was metric. The Americans were using metric, and it kind of paid out in 10 centimeter lengths with one person holding the starting end, and the other person walking out and dropping lengths at intervals, and then finally the two would measure or count out the number of links paid out, and that would give you the measurement. And this was Gilbert's. This was the work that Gilbert was in charge of, and one reason is that it needed two people, and Gilbert spoke Greek better than Picard, so it was probably Gilbert and the Greek assistant who were managing the chain measuring. Both men, though, had training in survey. Picard had probably taken surveying classes at Dartmouth, where it was Dartmouth had a big surveying emphasis because of its practical and agricultural emphases in the 1880s, and Gilbert also had survey training for the reason that many Black colleges and universities in the South included surveying because it was considered a quote unquote practical or industrial skill that was appropriate for Black students. So many of the HBCUs had surveying on their in their curricula, and Gilbert might also have studied surveying at Brown, which also had a surveying elective. So you can see here in this photograph some of the people I've been talking about this time. By the way, there was a Greek E4 supervisor, Vasilios Leonardos. Here's Charles Waldstein. You can always tell him with his pith helmet. Rufus Richardson, John Picard, Andrew Fossum. Gilbert is not in this photograph, I think, because he is holding the rod that Picard he's working with Picard as part of the survey team. And if we zoom in on this, this is actually the first, as far as I can tell, this is the first known photograph of an American archaeologist in Greece using a scientific instrument. I consulted with the curator of instruments collection at Harvard, Sarah Schechner. She tells me this is a particular type of theodolite, an alta azimuth theodolite, which is optimized for doing things like taking elevations. So a very good instrument for the purposes that Gilbert and Picard were using it for in their survey. And Gilbert, in his article, summarizes the results of their investigation. And he points to the Acropolis as the place where the best walls representing different periods of the city's history are preserved. These polygonal walls representing the earliest period, these more ashlar walls representing a later period. That's Rufus Richardson, by the way. When Richardson came back 2 years later, this had already been destroyed. So this no longer exists. So their conclusions were at the very, very beginning of American Archaeological Survey, but they were significant nonetheless. One thing they wanted to test in particular was a statement by Strabo, who said that old Eretria, destroyed by the Persians, was still to be seen as a ruin, and that new Eretria was founded anew, which people in the 1880s interpreted as founded at a different place. Even Wilhelm Dirkfeldt thought post-Persian Eretria was going to be found somewhere else, east of where the ruins of the visible ruins were here. But in their publication or in their study, Gilbert and Picard made a chronology which suggested that the city had always been on the same site. First, the polygonal Acropolis walls I showed you, they argued must be pre-Persian. The lower circuit, which was less polygonal, also pre-Persian. And then the addition of ashlar towers along the Acropolis and what they called a Roman cross wall, a loosely built wall of rubble, suggested to them that the city had been rebuilt on the same place after the Persian destruction. So in other words, Strabo was wrong and Dirkfeldt was wrong. And as Gilbert put it, this work has quite satisfactorily proven that old and new Eretria occupied the same extent of territory. And that's the view that we still know today after much more extensive excavations by Greek and Swiss archaeologists. In some of the particulars, they were very wrong, but they laid a foundation for the very successful work that's gone on at Eretria since the mid 20th century. Now I've got a bit more than 40 minutes, so let me see what I'll end with a pretty photograph. So you can see the Eretria that Gilbert and Picard visited and that John Wesley Gilbert helped to survey has grown into a moderately sized town. And so much of what they examined has disappeared, And even up on the Acropolis, where the walls are well preserved, some of those towers were destroyed in the subsequent years. So standing at the beginning of American archaeological exploration in Greece, John Wesley Gilbert was part of the most complex, the most advanced survey that the school had yet conducted, and it laid the way for the work that would take place at Corinth, at the Argive Heraeon, and elsewhere as American archaeology advanced. So I'll just leave you with that last photograph of Gilbert and Picard down by the shore. You know, I write in my book, we often think in the popular mind of archaeology as digging, but if Gilbert was the first Black archaeologist, and he is the first professionally trained African-American archaeologist, his big contribution was in survey. It wasn't in digging. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much, and be delighted to take any questions or comments that you might have. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, John. I'm going to stop your screen share so we can.
Okay.
Let's see. Or can you stop it? Let's see.
I'm going to stop my share here, and if
Thank
you ever need any picture to come back up, I can easily do that. But it's nice to see everybody. And I already see some questions in the.
Yeah. Well, before I pop over to the chat, can I ask, so was it pretty much common for people who were tenured at, for a year at the Institute to have their time co-opted, or to volunteer on these projects while they're also trying to write a thesis and do all this work? I mean, these are long days and a very busy schedule. Was that a common practice?
In the early years, people had members of the school had a much more latitude in what they were going to do. And they don't seem to have been required to go along. But the 4 students all did go to Eritrea, I think because they were interested. Now, Gilbert did not go on one major trip to the north of Greece on this like 10-day long slog through the mud that the others went on. And I think, Aaron, you're absolutely right. He had library work to do. And he was coming from a school, Paine College, which had no library to speak of. And to get his MA, he had to finish a reading list, and he had work to do, and he had a child coming. And so I argue in the book that he stayed home because he wanted the library time, and he was perfectly happy to let everyone else go, walk to Marathon in the rain and, eat boiled eggs and drink Retsina because he had time at home. So the fact that they all went to Eritrea, I think, is because they were all interested. They wanted to take part in it. But there were times when Gilbert decided that he had other things that were better than the archaeology. Yeah.
Can I also ask, how did you come to this topic? I mean, it's very clear that you have a bunch of bios there, and I mean, if one could say it, you were developing a series of future research topics. Any one of those were a deep dive into the biographies of these individuals and their contributions. How did you come to it?
Yes. In particular, John Picard, I was talking earlier, I mentioned I met his great granddaughter. None of Gilbert's relatives. Gilbert had no grandchildren, so he has no living relatives. But Picard is a fascinating figure and has a lot to do. I don't know if a Caymanid specialists are here, but I was trying to write a book on Persian civil wars. At Karsten Binder's, commentary on Plutarch's Artaxerxes, which is a terrific book, but at a certain point, I thought, I don't read Akkadian. I don't have any access to tablet material. It's very difficult to say new things. I got frustrated. I was looking for a side topic. I had read about Gilbert in a short article published by Michelle Valerie Ronick, who I think she's done a great deal of work in bringing to light Black classical scholars. I thought I'll write something because he was at the school and I was at the school. It'll be easy. It'll be an article. And then 6 years later, it's a book. So it was not something that I did not plan to do it at all. Yeah.
Cool.
Should I go do you like me to answer some of the questions?
Well, I think a couple of the folks were saying that they had to pop out, but
there's how about Larry Kripe?
Have you got a separate line on questions?
Oh, I guess he direct messaged me. Okay, so Larry's question is, can you give a little more background on how he got into archaeology and where he was educated? So taking the second part first, he was educated, Gilbert first studied in public school in Augusta, Georgia, so segregated public school. He studied at Paine College, which was a cooperative Black and white Methodist foundation. And then he transferred to Brown University, where he was the third Black graduate of Brown. I should have mentioned that. I showed a picture of him, of his senior picture. And it's at Brown that he got into archaeology because his Greek professor was Albert Harkness, who again, you have never heard of, but he was the most famous American classical scholar of the 1880s. He had been president of the American Philological Association. He was a founder of the AIA. He was part of the original managing committee of the American School. And he was Gilbert's Greek professor. And Harkness was a real booster of the school. And it must have been Harkness who said, Mr. Gilbert, you should consider this school. And more than that, Harkness found Gilbert funding a Brown graduate fellowship to go to Greece. And I mentioned William Sanders Scarborough. Scarborough could never find the money, but it was Harkness who mentioned the school to Gilbert and who found him the funding that he was able to, that made it possible for him to go to Greece. And the archaeology part, Larry, Harkness was also unusual because he didn't just teach Greek, he taught Athenian history and he taught material culture as far as he could in his classes. So he was quite old by the 1880s, but he was unusually interested for a classical scholar of his day in the archaeological part. And so Harkness deserves a great deal of credit for it.
Have you been able to reconstruct the students of Gilbert? People, it's one thing to be able to tell what his pedigree was in terms of education, but then the legacy, if you will.
Yes. I mentioned that John Wesley Gilbert taught at Paine. It was Paine Institute till 1903. It's still Paine College today. And he taught a generation of Black teachers, ministers, and other prominent people coming into business, lawyers, doctors. If the two most famous of Gilbert's students are one, John Hope, who was the first Black president of what's today Morehouse College and Atlanta University, who studied with Gilbert at Paine College. And John Hope was also Augustan. And then Channing Tobias, who was later a national leader of the NAACP. And he also educated a large number of leaders in his church, which is the CME, or the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. And the CME church, some of the men who studied with Gilbert would go on to become leaders in that church, especially in its expansion during the Great Migration into the north. And there's even a CME church in Santa Monica. And in 1916, Gilbert actually took the train from Georgia out to California to visit this church. He spoke at USC, he spoke at Santa Monica, he spoke in Oklahoma. He commented on the growth of the church, which had just been founded in 1908. So his students were involved in teaching, in ministry, and the expansion of the church.
Thank you. That's really, really, really fascinating. Any other questions out there that you want to entertain, talk a little bit more about? Some very interesting biographies. It's just really interesting to see all these different characters and the things they contributed to. Yeah, Ken mentioned that scandal. You said you could say something else.
Talk about the scandal. Yeah. So the excavations at Eretria began in January of 1891, when Andrew Fossum went out to the site by himself, which I thought was weird. But I didn't really think much about it until I read Waldstein's diary, which I was able to get. The International Olympic Committee archives are really, they have all his correspondence and his material, and it's there because Waldstein was a big player in the 1896 Olympics. He actually competed for the United States, so his papers are there. And in his diary, he says, and it's like January 19th or 22nd, he says, "Big trouble about Fossum. Fossum must leave the American school. This is serious." And it's something about, this is what happens when you sit him next to the young lady. And I think that there had been some sort of scandal, and I don't, Waldstein doesn't say what it was, but this American school students lived on the ground floor, and then on what's today the kitchen floor, I guess it still is, there were Greek servants, but there was a German governess. for Rufus Richardson's 3 young children. And if I had to kind of hazard a guess that something had happened in that situation, that's my speculation, but whatever it was super serious. And so Waldstein went immediately to Panayotis Kavadias, who's the in charge of permits, and Kavadias and Waldstein are good friends. And 2 days later, Waldstein sends Andrew Fossum up to Eritrea with $500 in cash and instructions like to get started digging. So it was, you know, there was a hidden scandal back down beneath this early excavation. I found it in 1937. Fossum actually wrote a little memoir of his own account in pencil, but he doesn't mention this at all. It's no surprise that it was something that he didn't want to commit to paper, even all those years ago. So it must have been something. But it was cold and wet and rainy, and the decision was not a plan. It was a reaction to this scandal.
So I guess if by way of closing, what next? Where do you go with this? I mean, have you got some leads on an expansion of this particular topic, or the work on Gilbert, or any of the bios that you've come across? Did you?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, before the talk, I have this Achaemenid work to get back to, and there's Xenophon to get back to. So I have some work on that. But I think the one thing I mentioned is that, in the course of this project, I made good friends in Augusta at Paine College and in the various historical associations and the local community. And so one of my projects is sort of trying to promote and talk about archaeology to the community there. And this takes us back to Don's project, the Archaeology 101. I'm actually going in 2 weeks to speak at A.R. Johnson Magnet School, which is I think a science magnet school, a public school in Augusta, to 8th graders and 11th graders to talk about science and archaeology. Mm-hmm. So these kinds of, that's more of a public history project than a history project. But beyond that, Picard, Brownson, there's a lot more to be done about the early history of the school. And if I guess Paul just dropped off. We were just talking with Natalia by email about Emerson Howland Swift, who was a major figure at Corinth. And so kind of using the modern knowledge I've developed to expand our knowledge of the American school and archaeology in Greece is part of it. Yeah. So, now I got a foot in antiquity and in the modern world. I'm going to have to keep up with both. Yeah.
Well, we'll have to have you back to report on some of those developments, and maybe you and Dawn can have a conversation. That can be part of our program, since she's in our chapter. Delighted to have you, John. Thanks for talking about your book with us, and we look forward to keeping up with your work. And again, thanks so much.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you all for being here this evening.